I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 104 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting today for its study of Report 2, Housing in First Nations Communities, and Report 3, First Nations and Inuit Policing Program of the 2024 reports of the Auditor General of Canada. Now, colleagues, before we start today, I have a new practice that the House is introducing that we've been asked to share with all members. So this relates to avoiding audio feedback for our interpreters. And so before we begin, I'd like to remind all members and other meeting participants in the room of the following important preventative measures. To prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries, all in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from all microphones at all times. As indicated in the communique from the Speaker to all members on Monday, April 29th, the following measures have been taken to help prevent audio feedback incidents. All earpieces have been replaced by a model which greatly reduces the probability of audio feedback. The new earpieces are black in color, whereas the former earpieces were gray. Please only use a black approved earpiece. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of a meeting. When you're not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker for this purpose that you'll find on the table as indicated. So they've now given us, put your headpiece here stickers, so we ask everybody abide by that. Please consult the cards on the table, which are these ones, for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has also been adjusted to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. I thought that my eyesight had just deteriorated over the week that we were away and that the back of the room had become much further. But I think we have people back there, right? Welcome. It's far, yes. And that's our part of these, the new measures. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Thank you for everyone's cooperation. So now moving on to today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is meeting today for its study of Report 2, as I mentioned, Housing in First Nations Communities, and Report 3, First Nations and Inuit Policing Program of the 2024 reports of the Auditor General of Canada. I would like to now welcome our witnesses. From the Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada, and Doreen Devine, Director. So you'll have up to 5 minutes opening remarks for each of the reports, if you'd like it, and then we'll get into our rounds of questions. So over to you. The floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you. I just want to confirm, are we doing just housing first and then resuming? So I only have to read.
Yeah. So that's right. We'll do
now?
one
Okay.
in 5 minutes opening statement and then rounds. And then we'll come to the second report and do another opening statement on that one.
Thank you. Thank you for confirming. I thought you were much further than the last time I was in this room. So, right. Monsieur le Président, merci de nous donner l'occasion.
Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on housing in First Nations communities, which was tabled in Parliament on March 19, 2024. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This area is also known as Ottawa. I express my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples who have contributed to shaping and safeguarding the beautiful lands they call home throughout Canada.
Dans les collectivités des Premières Nations n'ont pas accès à des logements sécuritaires et en bon état. Dans l'ensemble.
Sorry, Laurie, Ms. Idlu, please go.
I'm so sorry to interrupt the speaker, but we weren't able to see the speaker for quite a bit of time there. I wonder if that's something that can be addressed.
Okay, we're just checking with the technical team, so we'll just pause for 1 second until we get everything up and running this morning. Okay, looks like we're good. Laurie, you should be able to see our guest now. Okay, please continue.
Thank you. Dans l'ensemble, nous avons
Overall, we found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation made little progress in supporting First Nations to improve housing conditions in their communities. Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation are responsible for working with First Nations to meet their housing needs by 2030. Although $4 billion was spent over the past 5 years to build new homes, repair existing ones, and increase First Nations capacity to manage housing, we found that in 2023, 80% of needs were still not met. The percentage of homes that need major repairs or replacement remains largely unchanged, and this despite the spending that has gone into building and repairing homes. In 2021, the Assembly of First Nations estimated that $44 billion were needed to improve housing in First Nations communities, and the needs continue to grow.
Excuse.
I apologize. We found that the department and the corporation had not prioritized communities with the greatest needs. First Nations communities with the poorest housing conditions received less funding than communities of the same size with better housing conditions.
In First Nations homes is a long-standing health hazard, and we found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation still did not know the magnitude of the problem. In fact, the department and the corporation are currently not following the strategy that they developed in 2008 to address this problem, and neither could explain why the strategy is no longer used. There is no plan in place to tackle this issue. This is the fourth time since 2003 that we are raising the alarm about unsafe and unsuitable housing in First Nations communities. Adequate housing is a basic human need. After 4 audit reports, I can honestly say that I am completely discouraged that so little has changed and that so many First Nations individuals and families continue to live in substandard homes. Time after time, whether in housing, policing, safe drinking water, or other critical areas, our audits of federal programs to support Canada's Indigenous peoples reveal a distressing and persistent pattern of failure. The lack of progress clearly demonstrates that the government's passive, siloed approach is ineffective and, in fact, contradicts the spirit of true reconciliation. A fundamental shift is urgently needed to drive significant progress in providing proper support to Indigenous families and communities across the country, especially those most in need who currently are too often left behind. While the government is at the early stages of transferring its responsibilities for housing to First Nations, unless the department and corporation take meaningful action to address the issues we have identified, it is unclear if the transfer will be successful. It is important to understand that these are not legacy issues that live in the past. They are ongoing and perpetual, with direct consequences that people experience on a daily basis. And they stand in contradiction to Canada's commitment to truth and reconciliation. We made 8 recommendations to improve the government's delivery of housing programs to First Nations communities. We are concerned that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation only partially agreed with our recommendation that they work with communities with the poorest housing conditions to ensure that they receive the support they need to improve housing conditions. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening comments. I will point out to the members before we start into our rounds of questions that we had invited the ministers and officials for the 2 auditors' reports to join us today. Unfortunately, due to their schedules, they weren't able to join us, so that's why we have the Auditor General's reports happening both today. And there may be items that are technical that would be more appropriate addressed to the officials and the ministers. And so I know that the Auditor General and her team will do the best that they can to answer, but there may be times that they will need to deflect to the departments. We are working with the ministers' teams to find dates to have them come and do the follow-up questions on both of these studies. And that is being worked on. I don't have dates, but we are trying to get them as soon as possible. So just as you get into your questions, know that that may be a response that you get. But we're going to have the best conversation that we can based on the study that was done, particularly now at this first hour on housing. So first up, Mr. Zimmer, I have you for your 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you once again, Karen. I asked you if I could say Karen. It's a little easier. It's a little nicer, hey? But thank you for this report. I was just up in a remote community where I met Kevin. He was there raising his 3 grandchildren in a very difficult housing situation. There was mold in different spots in the house. I don't think there was one working window in the house. The bathroom sink couldn't function, so you imagine just a bathroom sink with all these kids not working, what kind of situation that was like, and sort of that despair that they felt, in that situation. And then I contrast that with Brian, who many years ago, his parents were couch surfing, and eventually got a house. And he said it was life-changing for us as a family. He said once we had a house, my dad became an electrician, my mom became an administrator, and sort of the world opened up to them in a positive way. So you have 2 contrasts, right? Despair and opportunity. But I think what's troubling for me is that what you mentioned in your report, this was brought up before, and I kind of empathize with you if you've been in the office that long, maybe not as the boss, but working in the office. But this has happened before. So in a previous Conservative government, in 2008, there was a report similar to this report, and there was some action that actually happened from that, and it was called the Moldy Housing Strategy, and there was real efforts to combat those issues and those sort of terrible housing situations. And I'll get to my question, but I guess you can answer, but I'd like you to maybe expand on it a bit more. Didn't you find that they're following that advice and using that methodology of making sure that things are getting better?
So you're pointing out, I think, something that I mentioned about having 4 audits and really seeing that conditions have not dramatically improved, right? Over the last few years, there's been about $4 billion spent, and while it has gone to building homes and doing major repairs, it has resulted in very little meaningful improvement in conditions across all the communities. And when it comes more directly to mold, I tell you, it was a recommendation that we gave in one of our previous audits. We audited housing in 2003, 2006, 2011, and now in 2024. The mold strategy, I believe, was out of our 2003 or 6 audit. We saw in 2011 that it was developed, but we made recommendations around it not being fully implemented or being fully followed. So it was surprising to come in now and find out that no one could explain to us why they're not using it anymore.
Right.
And I would tell you that there's a few things missing. It's not just about having a strategy, but it's about knowing the extent of the mold problem, so you need to gather data for that. And we found that there was only one regional office in Alberta that was doing that for a while, and then they stopped. And this is why my overarching comment about the passive approach that the government is using is one that I think will not drive a meaningful change. Right. If you don't know the extent, how do you know what you need to fund, and how do you know who you need to help? So I would chalk that up to just being needing a wholesale different approach to right. tackling this problem in First Nations.
Using the word passive is kind, I believe. After 9 years, the strategy that was developed, for a fulsome explanation, the strategy was developed in 2008 by Indigenous Services Canada, then named Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, First Nations, and Inuit Health Branch at Indigenous Services Canada in partnership with the Assembly of First Nations. So you had everybody at the table really trying to step up and fix the problem. And I think you mentioned the billions. Sorry, I missed it. But this is after 9 years. You mentioned about how many billions have been spent, yet, and maybe just reiterate that percentage of housing need that still exists out there.
So our audit period spanned over 5 years. So it's over the last 5 years that about $4 billion has been spent on either major repairs or building new homes, yet 80% of the needs that had been identified in 2021 remain unmet.
For 80% are still unmet.
80% are still unmet, and that's linked to one of our big recommendations, was that you need to have a plan to figure out how to fund investments going forward. So the Assembly of First Nations had identified in 2021, they just updated their estimate, but in 2021 it was about $44 billion. But there was no plan put in place to determine how the government was going to fund that and finance it going
Karen,
forward.
I just have just a few minutes, or just I think a few seconds left. I think this is what sort of frustrations on both sides of this equation, right? You have the First Nations communities that have to live in this sort of situation where this huge amount of need and nothing's getting done, that frustration. And then on the other side, you have taxpayers that are giving lots of their taxes to fix the problem. So you have this, they're trying to help. And for some reason, that bridge is never built. Like, that gap's never filled. And I think that's, frustrations on both sides, especially after this government's been here for 9 years. You think you'd have seen some progress. But thanks for your work, and appreciate what you do.
Okay, thank you. We will go next to Mr. McLeod, who will have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our visitors here today for the presentation. And we certainly appreciate the discussion on this very important issue. I represent the Northwest Territories, and in my previous life as a cabinet minister of the government of Northwest Territories, I was the minister responsible for housing, and it was a challenging position. Housing is in a crisis mode and has been for some time in Northwest Territories. So when I got elected in 2015 as the MP, it didn't take long before housing came to be the biggest issue at all our community meetings with municipalities, with Indigenous governments, with the government in Northwest Territories, and in many different areas. Indigenous housing funding was non-existent with the previous government, and so we had to create a channel to get money flowing. Affordable housing, homelessness, every day we heard about those issues. Even to this day, we still hear on a regular basis. Today, I heard from the community of Tuktoyaktuk where they are facing a significant shortage in professional housing for teachers, so they may not be able to operate their school properly in the next coming school year. So there's still a huge gap, but it's very difficult. I'm finding in my job here as an MP to deal with CMHC and Indigenous services because we don't have the proper background. We don't have the statistics to back some of the arguments that we're bringing forward. So your report on housing in First Nations communities, it did not examine any communities in the territories or any of the initiatives for people off reserve. And as I said before, housing is the biggest issue in the communities in my riding. Could you explain why Northern First Nations were left outside of the scope of this report? And I recognize we only have 2 reserves, but we have Indigenous communities. They're not reserves, they're public communities, but they're Indigenous communities. Some of them are 95, 98% Indigenous, so that's my first question.
Sure. So I do want to acknowledge that the $4 billion that's been spent over the last 5 years has absolutely helped improve conditions for many, but the need is just so much greater than that. When it comes to scoping, this audit was looking at just the First Nations communities, and there are no reserves, as you mentioned, in some of the territories. So Nunavut has no reserves, and there are 2 in Northwest Territories that will be eligible for this program starting, I think it was starting in 2022, that they would be eligible to start accessing some of the funding. And Yukon has no reserves. So it's a very complex legislative environment. So they were excluded because this was about funding to communities on reserves. But in my office, in 2022, I did look at homelessness and the National Housing Strategy and the access that certain Indigenous communities can have to those programs. We looked more precisely at Yukon housing in 2023, and it is our intention to look at housing in Northwest Territories in 2024. So as you may know, I am also the Auditor General for the 3 territories, and so we do recognize that housing is a concern that is top of mind for so many people across our country, and we are making sure that we can do our part looking at how each level of government is tackling this. That's within the jurisdiction, obviously, of my mandate.
Thank you for that response. As the auditor for the 3 territorial governments, your office conducts audits for territorial entities and programs, and there was a report on the Yukon Housing Corporation released in 2022 from your office, and the last time we had a similar audit for the Northwest Territories and Nunavut was 2008. So given the importance of housing program in both territories, and can you just quickly clarify when? I thought I heard you say that you're considering a new audit for the housing corporations in both Nunavut and Northwest Territories.
So we recently completed one in the Yukon. Northwest Territories is 2024 is our hope, perhaps in the fall of 2024, and then in Nunavut, public housing most likely in 2025. So we work very closely with the legislatures in the 3 territories to figure out what makes sense to them, because we typically provide one performance audit a year or so for each of the territories. So those are the timeframes for the Northwest Territories and Yukon.
I'd like to ask, if I have time, about challenges doing audits and lack of statistical data available in the north. I know we come up against that in many different forms. Sometimes some of our applications for programs require certain information that doesn't exist in the north. Would you have any suggestions that you could provide on how there could be an improvement to the availability of the statistical data that we need?
I'm just going to jump in. If we could have just a brief response. We're at the end of the 6 minutes, but we'll give you the benefit of time for a brief response.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So that is definitely a hurdle that we identify in many of our audits in the territories, is the lack of information. It's either very manual and dispersed, and there is no sort of consolidated repository. That's a typical finding. I would tell you that we have findings like that even in this audit, right? You need to at least gather the information if you want to make a well-informed decision, and capacity, having a housing manager, is one of those essential elements needed to help ensure that communities can gather the information needed to better inform decision making. So hopefully that helps.
All right, thank you.
In a quick answer.
Okay, and now we'll go to Monsieur Lemire, who will have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hogan, for your report, which once again highlights an absolutely urgent need in Quebec and in Canada, and it's a key issue that affects human dignity. When we hear about 4 families living in one apartment, and we've been able to visit some families and some of these apartments, one cannot really develop in a healthy manner in these conditions. Same for the education of children, and it leads to many problems. Being able to have access to a bed is sometimes not an option for some people. And there are demands for a spending level of 44 billion, as you mentioned. So there are troubling aspects of this issue, and I will point to two recommendations of yours. And it says ISC and CMHC should collaborate with First Nations communities to determine their needs and the capacity requirements and to provide adequate financing. Similarly, CMHC and ISC should work with First Nations to revisit the structure and the delivery of their housing programs to simplify the process and facilitate access to funding. So in that, I see a problem with the structure of the programs and the accountability that is requested of Indigenous communities and leaders of these communities. It's very much a structural problem because funding is provided for a period of 2 years and the money goes back to the Treasury and sometimes it's not spent despite announcements made around budget time. Can we establish a link between the lack of adaptability of the programs to the reality on the ground of First Nations and the fact that there has been so much money that's gone back to the Treasury and this money was not spent in First Nations communities where they have needs? Well, the money that is not spent, and if we see that there's a lot of there are a lot of programs, money is usually spent. There usually wasn't a plan to determine how to come up with the necessary level of funding. But when you look at to whom the money has been distributed, that has to do with capacity. That's one of our recommendations. That's also what worries me. The department and the corporation agree partially with our recommendation, this particular one. In my opinion, the government should identify the communities that have the biggest needs, that have the worst conditions across the country, and they should make sure that they receive their fair share of the funding that is available. As we speak, communities that put up their hands, they have capacity to go through these processes. They are the ones that get the funding, and for smaller communities, it is taxing that whole process. It's not easy, and each community has different needs. It's not always the same, and in some communities, they don't have people who can manage housing, so they need to be able to identify these areas or come up with proposals, but in some other communities they don't have this exact same need. So it really has to be based on the unique needs of each community. And having said that, the programs are very complex. When you look at CMHC, for instance, for housing funding, they have 13 programs, and you need to apply separately to each of these programs and find out whether you are eligible or not for each of these 13. So it's not the structure should be made simpler and easier to access for the different communities. I really liked your answer, and you referred to the structure needing to be fair. I mean, many of these communities haven't had access to funding in the good part of the last decade, so they have a lot of catching up to do. So should there be measures that are a bit more retroactive to allow these communities maybe to have access to a bigger slice of the cake, as it were, so that they can make up for lost ground? Well, it's really up to the department and the corporation to decide how they want to manage the pot of money that is earmarked for housing. But under 2.6, we have a specific recommendation, and in the smallest of the communities, to make sure that they receive a fair share, some steps can be taken. But what we have seen is that in communities where more than 75% of the housing available needs major repairs or needs to be replaced, they usually receive less money than communities that are in better shape in terms of housing. And I would really encourage the department to look into this and to try to find what specific supports each community would need to have access to the funding. And allowing, like, creating these programs over 5 years or 10 years, does it really allow expertise to be created in the different communities? Well, there is a lack of capacity to identify a plan to come up with a specific plan outlining housing needs. So they just need to have assurance that the money will be available. But once again, that is a policy question, and it's really not up to me to come up with a specific answer. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we'll go to Ms. Idlut, who, when you're ready, Ms. Idlut, you'll have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
For criticism of the lack of commitment from this Liberal government for so many years already. Just to summarize some of what I've heard, 80% of the First Nations housing has not been met. The strategy that they developed has not been implemented. The Auditor General has made 4 reports and recommendations have not been implemented. And the National Housing Advocate has also made some criticisms about this government's lack of commitment to addressing the First Nations housing need. Since we're only talking about First Nations, I'd be a lot more scathing if it included Inuit, but I'm glad to hear that that audit is coming up for Nunavut. We haven't heard what the realities are for Métis, and hopefully we'll get some information later as well about the housing needs for Métis. But I have a specific question for you. I'm not sure if you've read the 2024 budget, and this 2024 budget has an investment of $918 million over 5 years. Could you explain to us if that will be enough to fill or close the housing gap for First Nations?
So that's a question I would absolutely encourage you to ask the department and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. All I can point to is what the Assembly of First Nations identified as being needed to help meet the housing needs of First Nations communities. In 2021, that was pegged at about $44 billion. The federal government agreed with that assessment. They were part of, they actually asked the First Nations, Assembly of First Nations to do that. There has been a very recent one. When my audit was ongoing, it was in draft. It has since been finalized, and you can see that that need has almost tripled in order to meet the current housing needs for First Nations communities. So I believe it's much higher than what's sitting in the budget. But this is why you need a plan, right? You can't fund all of these housing needs in 1 year. It would be impossible to even spend that kind of money in a meaningful and intelligent way. And so you do need a plan to figure out what is the gap identified now by third parties, and then how do you fund that type of investment over time, and then how do you support communities to actually spend it. What we saw in our audit is there was priority given to shovel-ready projects or projects that were quick to turn around, but that isn't the case for all projects. So you need to make sure that you've thought about the needs of each community, whether they be small or large.
Thank you. Having done this recent audit and remembering the previous audits, it seems that because recommendations haven't been implemented, strategies haven't been implemented, do you think that this Liberal government has the capacity to even develop a plan and implement it?
I guess my response to that would be even this committee in 2022 provided a recommendation that a comprehensive investment plan was needed in order to fund, at the time, what was seen as the gap to close housing needs on First Nations communities. I have yet to see that. The responses to our recommendations now show that there is a timeline set to develop that plan. And I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you whether they'll be able to do that, but I hope that between pressures from First Nations communities, parliamentary committees, and my office, that we will see some progress in a positive trend.
If they are not listening to First Nations communities, they're not listening to the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee, they're not listening to the Auditor General's recommendations, who else should be pressuring them to make sure that the First Nations housing needs are being met? Everyone is telling them what these tremendous gaps are. Who else can we scream at to make sure that they're getting the investments that they need?
I'm not sure I have a better answer than what you've suggested. I think that the parties who have the ability to help influence are doing their part. It is now up to the government to develop a plan and to figure out how this will be funded going forward. I just hope that it is continuously done in continuous dialogue with Indigenous people, so that it's done in a way that meets their needs and their culture.
How much time do I have left?
30 seconds.
Oh, okay. I'll cede it to my next 2.5 minutes.
Thanks, Ms. Edlund. We will then go to our next round, starting with Mr. Schmale. I found my flashcards here, so I'll use the yellow card when there's 30 seconds left and the red card when time's up. So for those who can see, keep an eye on those. And yeah, can you see them down there? Anyway, Mr. Schmale, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Auditor General, for once again talking about your latest report on housing. I'd like to focus in on some of your comments regarding the slow approach for not only the department itself, but also the CMHC for their progress addressing this very important issue. You had mentioned that the department has been very slow to react to some of the realities on the ground. And you mentioned the words fundamental shift. I want to talk about what you mean by that through your work when you say fundamental shift. How do you see this playing out?
So I guess I would mention two things. The first is that I find the current policies and practices that both Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation are using really predate many of the government's commitments, the current commitments, whether it be commitments to truth and reconciliation or following with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? The goal of going to reach those who are furthest behind and moving them first is a real key sustainable development goal. But the current approach doesn't really follow that. So when I turn to what do I mean by a fundamental shift, it would be in that approach, but also in how programs are structured. So right now, if you had an infrastructure need in a First Nation community linked to drinking water, well, there are drinking water programs. If you have a need related to housing, well, there's the housing program, some programs to apply for. And I could pick another need, and there would be another grouping of programs. Communities need to know where they are, how many they are, what each program is targeted to try and address, and then figure out how to apply for those to access funding. That means you also already know the universe of your needs in order to be able to link them to a program. So I call that a very siloed approach. The current approach of passivity is the one where every community needs to raise their hand and apply and say, I need this funding. And that doesn't really match up with the realities of First Nations communities right now who have capacity issues. For example, in this case, no housing manager. Very few communities that we surveyed have a housing manager. So how do you even know what your needs are without that capacity to identify? And that's the partial disagreement that we're seeing with the two entities is they don't want to change that approach. They believe First Nations should identify the approach and their needs, whereas I think a much more proactive approach is needed.
And that's kind of the thing I'm hearing when I meet with Indigenous leaders, especially First Nations. They spend a lot of their time trying to fill out endless grant applications, but again, it's one community versus another in some cases because of sometimes limited funds. It just seems to be a vicious circle that we're in where not only do they at some point, as you pointed out, have to have the right people in place on the ground, but also the right ability to fill out the right applications in order to potentially be successful for funding.
You're echoing comments that we heard from the communities that we met when we were doing this audit. They highlighted a few things for us. They said the complexity of the number of programs and the complexity of application was a barrier to them accessing funding. That they felt that when they could access funding, it was typically very slow to flow to them. But that the lack of really meaningful engagement, right? So there's engagement in order to apply, but not really engagement to appreciate the needs holistically of a community. And that's why I think a real fundamental shift, instead of just, here's a program for certain types of funding, we have decades of proof when it comes to housing that while it helps some, it's leaving 80% of the needs unmet. So something different needs to happen.
So when we talk about CMHC, some of this falls under their jurisdiction as well. You, and I'm going to paraphrase here, you had said during your comments that when you kind of laid it out for the department, CMHC included, they partially agreed with your diagnosis. How did they partially agree? It seems like fourth report, only getting worse. I don't understand what happened.
So their perspective is that a First Nations community should determine its needs and then apply for funding. And while I'm 100% in agreement that a First Nations community needs to identify its needs, the current approaches are barriers to accessing this, and there is inequitable funding going to communities who need it the most. Just to give you a parting comment, because I see the red folder. The parting comment I would give you is around the importance of data. If we looked at programs that Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation was running, they were using outdated census information that didn't reflect 20 years of demographic changes to First Nations communities. So even when there is that drive to make sure there is a more equitable access, if you're using bad data, then decisions aren't well informed.
I think Ms. Idlet gave her 2 minutes to me, did she? I think that's what I
I
heard.
think Ms. Idlet was trying to bank those for her next
I think
go-round.
she gave it to me. Yeah, that's what I heard.
Okay, we're going to go now to
Okay.
Mr. Carr, who will have 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Ms. Hogan, for that. Just to actually pick up on the last point, could you expand for us a little bit on the piece around demographic changes you referenced? What were some of those demographic changes? And specifically, if you happen to have it available to you, I come from Manitoba, as you may know. I'd be curious to understand specifically in the Manitoba context what some of those demographic changes were.
Okay. So I would encourage, Mr. Chair, the members to look at Exhibit 2.5 in our report. So this is an area where we looked at the programs that the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation receives funding to deliver. And we found that their allocation, they would allocate funding to regional offices, and that the formula used for that allocation used outdated census information. So it was 2001 census information when there is the most updated census 20 years later that they could have been using. So it's the demographic changes over those 2 decades that hadn't been reflected.
I appreciate that, but my question isn't the failure to recognize that. My question is, what were the demographic changes?
Oh, well, I mean, I think Statistics Canada would give you a better outlay of what they were, but it could be population growth, population moving, the need for more housing. I mean, the census will even point out that Indigenous people are 4 times more likely to live in overcrowded housing, so the need to have more housing simply. So all of that demographic information isn't reflected when you're using census information from 20 years ago.
Is there any information, and I'm happy to follow up with StatsCan as you suggest, but is there any information to show the movement of Indigenous peoples from reserve communities, for example, in Manitoba to Winnipeg? I know, having been a teacher and an administrator myself, that a big problem in Manitoba is that we don't have enough schools in communities, and what ends up happening is people leave the community, young people leave the community, and sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. So I'm just curious as to how that might play a role, but I appreciate the point that StatsCan
I unfortunately
is
don't have that
probably
kind
better
of
positioned.
layer of demographic.
Fair enough. Can you elaborate a little bit on what some of the biggest issues in the homes that are not meeting the standard or the quality that they have to would be? You've talked about mold. I'm wondering, are there other impacts that we're starting to see? So, for example, in northern Manitoba, flooding is always a problem. You look at what's happening with Peguis First Nation right now in terms of having a conversation about some of the hardships they've faced. Are there impacts of things like climate change, for example, that we're starting to see impact the quality of care that is needed for homes in whether that's my province of Manitoba or across the country?
I think what I would point to there is the two assessments that the Assembly of First Nations made around quantifying what it would take to close the housing gap for First Nations communities. And I mentioned in 2021, which is the numbers we referred to, which is the $44 billion. When you look at the most recent assessment done by the Assembly of First Nations, just linking to housing, it's almost tripled. And we asked them why. Why would it change so dramatically? And some of the reasons given were a demographic and population shift, but the effects of climate on housing. So the need to recognize that you need to build climate resilient homes now, whether it be the melting of the permafrost, whether it be natural disasters. So there's just a difference needed in the construction and the build, which I think is really important. Some of our findings around building codes and making sure that minimum standards are being met is important. It ensures that a house starts off on the right leg, right? That it's at least built sturdily.
Is there any data in that specifically, and again, you may point me to somebody else, but I'd be curious to know, because you talked about, and it makes sense to me here in the report between 2018 and 2023, that there was a substantial 60% increase in build costs. I imagine that a lot of that accounts for the 2021 to 23 period, which of course was the pandemic and supply chain disruptions, all of the things that drove costs. But how much of that, from what you understand, would be driven by the point you just raised, which is that when we're building a new home, it's very different from a home that would have been built in the 1940s or 50s, and we're taking into account these climate resiliency pieces. Do we have an understanding of where some of the major costs are in terms of materials that are needed? I note, for example, a shortage of workers. I've just finished looking at a CBC article from Member 2 in Nova Scotia not long ago that there is funding available, but part of the problem is that they don't have the ability, even once tapping members of their own community, to fulfill the labor needs. Can you just shed some light, John? I don't know. Am I out?
You're out of time, but I'll give you a brief response.
Sorry, yeah, you got to put those folders like here, because the tables are so far now, the peripheral doesn't hit it. But
I definitely see the folders going up.
yeah, you can raise your hand for me.
I can raise
yeah.
my hands if you'd like.
Anyway, very quickly, if you don't mind.
So I wish I had a better answer, and I don't. But I mean, I think you're raising some really important factors. The cost of building materials is another reason why the values have gone up. The ability of skilled workers to do the builds. I would tell you the short build season in many of the communities that we're talking about. So the remoteness and getting things out there are many factors that we couldn't target in on one element being a larger contributor over another. But when you do have the departments here, I would encourage you to ask them about some of the creative new builds that they are looking about. When I was with them at the Public Accounts Committee, they talked about non-traditional builds that they're trying to do in First Nations communities. So that might be an area that interests you when the department appears.
Excellent, thank you. We'll go to Monsieur Lemire now for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of your recommendations says that the CMHC should work with First Nations to finish the development of the framework under which responsibilities will be transferred from the department to the First Nations to enable a coherent approach. I would like to hear you expand on that. There is also an Indigenous housing funding initiative that's emerged recently, and there's also the LANSAF, the Indigenous Communities Funding Organization, and in Quebec there are similar examples. They are trying to create expertise in funding, in construction, in other building crafts. So, would you be inclined to think that these kinds of initiatives would be a part of the solution in order to respond to the shortage of housing in First Nations communities? I wouldn't want to discourage people away from exploring innovative approaches to fund housing in their communities. It is clear that partnering up with the private sector and the different levels of government is necessary for Indigenous communities because there is a great need. But when we talk about the transfers to First Nations, and if you look into the mandate of Indigenous Services Canada, their mandate is really to transfer all of their responsibilities to the First Nations communities. It is the reason of existence. And what we have observed during our audit is actually this. And there is no coherent plan across the departments to facilitate this transfer. There were some measures in connection with housing, but there was really no coherent global plan. And the transfer isn't just giving money or handing the programs over. It's all about making sure that the communities will have success once the transfer has been done and that they will achieve results. And it should come with support for the years following the transfer as well. And there's no plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now go to Ms. Idlout, who will have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the Auditor General, Ms. Karen Hogan. I'm very much appreciating all your frank responses. I'm going to turn to your recommendation 6.48, where it says Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and Health Canada, in consultation with First Nations, should develop a comprehensive strategy and action plan to address the problem of mold on reserves. I note that there have been interesting responses from Indigenous Services, from Canada Mortgage and Housing and Health Canada, but these responses to me seem quite minimal. As the Auditor General, what would be a comprehensive response that you would expect to make sure that, for example, mold contamination is being addressed, since you said that it is a significant problem? Like, what kind of response would be a lot more appropriate to make sure that mold contamination is actually being addressed?
Well, I would see a response linked to mold having a few elements. One is recognizing the need to understand the magnitude of the problem, so being able to collect from all communities what they may see as their concerns around mold. How many housing units in their community have mold, and which are priorities versus others. I would think what our audit has shown is that the needs are far greater than the funding that is currently available. And so you need to be able to prioritize that limited funding to those most in need, especially when it comes to a very serious health hazard. So I believe that you need to have information. And as I mentioned earlier in another response, one of the regional offices in Alberta was gathering that information, and they stopped gathering it. And the reason they told us was to eliminate reporting burden on First Nations communities. But then you're not making well-informed decisions. So it needs to start with data. That would be the first step of a good comprehensive plan. Then you actually need a plan that you're going to stick with and implement. They had a mold strategy plan that, as a previous member mentioned, was developed many years ago in consultation with First Nations communities, Indigenous Services Canada, and CMHC, but it's no longer being used and no one knows why. And so having a plan to know how to tackle the problem once you've identified the problem, and then figuring out how to fund it and systematically go after it, keeping in mind that you should try to go get those most in need first and bring them forward.
Hey,
Thank you.
That's the end
okay.
of the time on that one. We'll now go to Mr. Shields, who will have 5 minutes.
This here today. Your discouragement, what would be the first step in changing that from your discouraged to what you've seen for a number of years? What would change the first step to change that?
To change my discouragement, to
Yeah.
see, I think, concrete action that really has an impact on First Nations communities. I do believe that, as I mentioned, the policies and practices that are currently being used by Indigenous Services Canada and CMHC predate many of the current commitments, and so they need to be updated. If self-determination is really what the government would like to see for First Nations communities, then a different approach is needed. The current passive siloed one isn't working.
When you talk about, and you made a comment in your document here about the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation doesn't have the legislative position to do what they need to do?
This was linked to transferring programs and initiatives to First Nations communities. So, as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous Services Canada, their goal should be to transfer all of their programs and services to First Nations community in the spirit of self-determination. But the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation doesn't have a mandate to do that kind of dialogue and begin talking about transferring their programs linked to First Nations communities back to the communities. So that's a legislative issue that just doesn't exist for CMHC.
And you would suggest that's something that should occur?
Well, again, it's not my place to comment on policy, but I can highlight when there is a policy gap.
Okay, thank you. You talked about the worst and the evaluation. Whose responsibility is it to evaluate it when you say there are the worst and there are those who aren't? So whose job is it to evaluate that? Where's the criteria for that scale?
So when you mean the worst, you mean the communities most in need?
Yep.
That is really up to the communities to do the self-assessment. When I made reference to we looked at communities with 100 housing units or less, it was the communities themselves who identified that 75% or more of their homes were in need of major repair or replacement. So it really does start with the community knowing what its needs are, and that's why capacity building is critically important. We talk about housing managers, and what we found is that very few small communities have housing managers, even a part-time housing manager, to help them figure out what is needed in the community and then help apply for certain funding programs.
Understand the application process, so it's program funded. So if they lack the capacity, whose responsibility is it then? Is it the Indigenous and housing mortgage? Who's responsible then does it shift to when they don't have that capacity?
I think this is where one of my recommendations and thoughts sort of differ a bit from Indigenous Services and CMHC. I think it's the responsibility of CMHC and Indigenous Services Canada to say, okay, this community doesn't have a housing manager, so how can we support them? Do we have a way to help build that capacity or train someone or find it for them so that they can identify their needs and then be able to meet the program? Like, our recommendations now are really trying to drive a change within the current practices and policies. Put that aside, I think a fundamentally different approach would drive perhaps a different outcome, because I think the questions you're asking me are what the department and the Crown are asking themselves. Well, we don't want to impose this on First Nations communities, but when they don't have the capacity, they're never going to move forward, right? So there needs to be a recognition that some community might need different supports than other communities.
Which is the case in all our communities from that point of
Absolutely,
view.
absolutely.
When you say shovel-ready, the largest municipalities have a group of engineers, and they build all sorts of plans, sit on the shelf, and the government says, hey, here's a program, and they pull it on the shelf. Small communities can't do that. So what you're saying, there needs to be something in place for that gap.
Absolutely, and that's where the partial agreement came on our recommendation, is that the department and the Crown Corporation believe that First Nations should just identify their needs and apply, and I would like to see a much more proactive approach, because the smaller communities can't do those two things.
What about
Hey,
those
oops,
communities?
sorry, Martin, we're out of
done.
time.
Thank you.
And the last one on the housing report, we're going to go to Mr. Pawlowski for 5 minutes, and then we'll reset, have another opening statement on the policing reports and get going. But Mr. Pawlowski, right now, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Well, one of my greatest failures as an MP, and let's face it, there's been a lot of failures. You can ask the Conservatives and even my colleague from Winnipeg. Long list. But my greatest failure has been the inability to find funding, federal funding, for Fort Williams First Nations chronic care home, which I've been trying to do. Even my predecessor, Don Rusnak, was trying to do that. And everybody kind of passes the buck. It's not INAN's responsibility. It's not Health's responsibility. It's not CMHC's responsibility. But surely in Indigenous communities, like any other community, people get old. People have chronic problems, disabilities. Like, who builds housing for them in First Nations communities? And are we doing enough with respect to that? Did you look at that?
So we didn't slice the demographic population of those in need, if that's, I believe, is where your question is coming. I would argue that census information would probably provide that kind of granularity, but we did not look at it here.
So, and this question goes beyond this specific study. Who determines what you look into? And if I ask you to, will you look into that?
So I'm not sure I know what the request for me to look into, but I always take suggestions from any member of parliament or senator who would like to share with us topics, and we feed them into our audit selection. But ultimately, it is my decision to determine what we audit, when we audit, and who we audit, based on a really comprehensive and rigorous process that is ongoing every year.
Well, I think this is an interesting question you ought to consider. And now, having said that, I've got another question. So I've certainly been asked by isolated First Nations communities who need funding, for example, water systems, and the high cost of those water systems. And it occurs to me, with housing, you need a whole bunch of infrastructure before you can build the housing. You need sanitation, you need water, you need electricity. Now, I know there's been a lot of advances in recent years in terms of more sustainable housing, using solar, wind, composting toilets, heavy insulation for housing. I'm wondering, and you look at the funding we give to First Nations communities, are we adapting? Are we kind of considering new ways of building that uses those kind of processes rather than the kind of 1945, you need electrical poles, you need waterworks, you need sanitation systems? And would that perhaps not be a more efficient use of money than being stuck in 1955?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and I have to admit that would be looking at perhaps the different types of funding programs that Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation have available. It would probably be a great question to the two of them. They have decided the types of programs, like the funding sectors that are available under housing, and so it would be interesting to see if they have a green one. We really didn't look at that sort of slicing and dicing. We were looking at funding for housing, period, and really targeting in on new builds that were needed and major repairs that were needed. Major repairs when a house is almost uninhabitable. So we were really trying to hit sort of fundamental things versus really targeted things. I might also suggest that the member would like to look at one of the reports I believe the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development is releasing tomorrow on green procurement in the federal government. So there might be some good lessons learned there that could be applied to housing and funding programs for Indigenous communities.
Is there time left?
Trying to push it as
I
close.
guess
A minute left.
when we in the government dedicates funding for Indigenous housing, does that money also go to towards the infrastructure that's required in order to build those homes? And are those two linked together, or should they be linked together? Because obviously, you can't build the houses when you don't have those other things.
So there is money for lot servicing, I think is probably the right term to use around making sure that some of the infrastructure is there. That was not something that we focused in on, but there is funding available for that through these two entities, yeah.
We're pretty much out of time on that one, so we'll stop here. And thank you for taking us through the first report on housing. Now, if you'd like to go to your 5-minute statement on policing, we'll turn the floor over. If you need to take a break for some water or anything.
Switch a few people and
yeah,
water
absolutely. So we
refill, and
can-
yeah, it was great.
We'll suspend for a couple of minutes and just let me know when you're ready and we'll get things back. Okay, so colleagues, we're suspended for a moment. going to continue on with the second report, this one on policing. And so, Ms. Hogan, when you're ready, I'll turn the floor over to you for your 5-minute opening statement.
Merci. Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on the First Nations and Inuit policing program, which was tabled in Parliament on 19th of March 2024. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This area is also known as Ottawa. I express my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples who have contributed to shaping and safeguarding the beautiful lands they call home throughout Canada. Joining me today are Joanne Schwartz, the principal who was responsible for the audit, and Mélanie Joannis, the director who led the audit team. The First Nations and Inuit policing program was created in 1991. We last audited this program in 2014, 10 years ago. And again, this time, we found critical shortcomings in how it is being managed. Public Safety Canada is the lead in managing and overseeing the program. We found that the department did not work in partnership with Indigenous communities to provide equitable access to policing services that were tailored to their needs. Through the program's community tripartite agreements, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, delivers dedicated policing services that supplement the ones from the province or territory. We found that the RCMP did not work in partnership with Indigenous communities to provide proactive policing services.
Significantly increased over the last 10 years, we found that $13 million of funds earmarked for the 2022-23 fiscal year went unspent. As of October 2023, Public Safety Canada anticipated that over $45 million of program funds would be left undispersed at the end of the 2023-24 fiscal year. This is concerning in the context of a program intended to support the safety of Indigenous communities. Public Safety Canada did not have an approach to allocate funds equitably to communities. The department told us that it relied on the province's or territory's readiness to fund their share of the program and on past funding received by communities to determine the amounts allocated. Over the past 5 years, the RCMP has been unable to fully staff the positions funded under the community tripartite agreements. This leaves First Nations and Inuit communities without the level of proactive and community-focused policing services that they should receive. Lastly, neither Public Safety Canada nor the RCMP could identify whether requirements set out in policing agreements were being met and whether the program was achieving its intended results. It is important to monitor and analyze data not only to meet the community's security and safety needs, but also to support the self-determination of these communities. Given that this program has not been updated since 1996 and long-standing issues persist, Public Safety Canada must work with First Nations and Inuit communities, provinces, and territories, as well as the RCMP, to find a way to more effectively provide proactive and culturally appropriate policing services. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you again for another opening statement. So with that, we'll get right into our first round of questions. First up, I have Mr. Melillo, who will have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for remaining with us here for this important discussion on policing now. Of course, we know policing is an essential service, an important service that every Canadian, every person across the country has to be able to rely on. And you mentioned, obviously, in the report, and I believe you just mentioned in your remarks about the money that has been allocated but not dispersed, the stuff that hasn't been getting through. You said $45 million anticipated that was going to be left on the table in the last fiscal year. That's incredibly alarming to me, considering what we're hearing from police chiefs across the country saying that they don't have adequate funding, that it's not enough. We see that playing out in my area, in northwestern Ontario, unfortunately far too often, where there's just isn't enough, there aren't enough officers on duty. It's led to tragic circumstances. It has led to deaths of people who haven't been able to have appropriate service, and it wouldn't be acceptable anywhere else in the country. Can you speak to what the government has, have they given any explanation for why these dollars haven't been dispersed?
I would highlight two areas, one linked to public safety's role and then one linked to the RCMP's role. So this program is one that is a cost-sharing program. So the federal government provides 52% of the funding, and the provinces or territories bring 48% to the table. What we heard is that if the federal government earmarks more funding to support the policing program, the province or territory needs to bring their fair share too for the additional funding to be able to flow. So that is part of the reason why some of the funds are going unspent. Some of the money was received so that public safety could transition or grow, so put more communities into the tripartite agreements or transition some from tripartite to self-administered programs, but we saw very little, no growth really in that area. Most of the additional funding was done just to meet the current existing needs and not expand the program. So that would be the public safety side. The second side would be where the RCMP comes into play. They are not party to this agreement, but they need to provide the policing services. And what we found is that they have been unable to staff many of the positions. In 2023, 61 of the positions that were supposed to receive funding under this program were vacant. And that's a big gap. It should note, however, that is consistent with a larger staffing gap that the RCMP has to manage. The interesting interplay here is that the RCMP often provides policing services provincially already. And then these are over and above in Indigenous communities. So we do see at times that police officers are called to do what I would say are regular provincial policing services versus this real community-focused policing service under the program.
Comprehensive, and I appreciate that answer very much. Just want to get to a few other things. Obviously, there's so much in this report. Public Safety Canada, in the report, you mentioned that it had not defined what equitable funding meant. Can you expand a bit on that, why it was not defined? Has there been any explanation from the department on that?
Well, I will see if Joanne or Melanie want to jump in on it, but it is written right into the policy development, is that it needs to be an equitable allocation to communities. So what does that look like? Should it be based on just the number of people who live in the community? Should there be another set of criteria or is it that they have comparable services to non-Indigenous communities? So until you've defined what equitable means, how do you know how much funding is needed or how many positions are needed to deliver that kind of service? Did I answer that comprehensively? There we go. Nothing to add. Yeah.
For one more, before I get the card from the chair there, just want to talk about the negotiations themselves. We've seen agreements expire very recently with no plan to renew. There's a real concern that the government isn't negotiating in good faith, and it was mentioned in the report that many First Nation Inuit communities felt that the engagement did not reflect true negotiations. Can you expand on what you found in terms of that?
So I think it's important to distinguish between the two types of agreements that are under this program. So if we looked at self-administered, where Indigenous communities are providing their own police services and they're just receiving funding, there was a much better engagement there. There was a regular need. Now, was it what it should be? I'm not sure, but it definitely was better than under the tripartite agreements. The tripartite agreements, where the RCMP provides the policing services, most of those agreements have an auto-renewal policy, and the auto-renew is on a 10 to 15-year period. And so that's a really long time to go without having a dialogue with communities. I think the last thing I would mention about, we heard the same feedback, that it wasn't really a true negotiation or discussion, was because often the federal government came to the table with the province or territory already knowing how much funding would be available to this community. So really, you can't really negotiate if you needed different services or more funding.
We will now go to Mr. Pawlowski, who will have 6 minutes.
You talked about equitable funding. Now, how does funding for Indigenous communities compare to funding for non-Indigenous communities? If you look at funding per capita that goes to the police from all levels of government in Indigenous communities versus non-Indigenous communities, can you tell me, like, how do they compare? Are they close? Are they different?
I am going to turn to either Joanne or Melanie to add to this. I think the one thing I would make as they gather their thoughts is it's about equitable access to the funding. So communities are already receiving policing services by the fact that they live in a province or territory where there is policing services. This program is meant to bring really community-tailored and focused services over and above to help rebuild that trust relationship with law enforcement. And so it is for a different need than just regular policing services. So I'll leave that on the table and then see if Joanne or Melanie want to add in.
Thank you for that. So as part of our audit, when we looked at equitable access, we focused on the available funds. We didn't do a direct comparison to amounts available to Indigenous versus non-Indigenous communities. And as the Auditor General said, the policy for this program is explicit that equitable funding arrangements should be in place. And we did ask the department how that was determined, and they hadn't defined it. And further than that, they didn't have any approach on how they were going to allocate funds equitably to the people who are recipients of the program.
If you look at funding that goes for policing in Indigenous communities, particularly remote Indigenous communities, and I've worked in some of those communities, a lot of the money is going to be paying to fly up the police officer, their families, for their housing, and doesn't even end up going towards the actual act of policing and patrolling and responding to complaints. So is not that a major factor in cost, and especially remote communities?
I guess what I would mention there is that we actually surveyed, I think, some detachments and asked them, what do you think the goal of the main service you should be providing under the Indigenous and Inuit policing program versus regular policing services? And I'm not going to use the right term, so I apologize to anyone in law enforcement who I'm going to offend. But so there's sort of the regular policing services, the enforcement and keeping good law and order, and then there is a community-based education and focus approach. And the Inuit program is that community-based one. So you know, it's about understanding that it's for something different than the typical approach. And if you look at all these communities, that sort of punitive or you know, top-down enforcement is not the kind of policing Indigenous communities want to receive. And so it's about understanding the needs of your communities, and the people aren't being dedicated towards that and receiving the sensitivity that they need, the cultural sensitivity training that they need to do that kind of policing service.
Now, I think you said in 2022, 2023, 13 million in available funding wasn't used, and I think, what, 45 million in the next year. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you said partly that's because there hasn't been the matching provincial funding, which is required. Can you tell us which provinces or territories have not been forthcoming in matching the funding?
So there were many things that contributed to the funds not being spent. That is definitely one of them, and I don't know if someone has the level of detail of by province. Sorry, we don't know that, but I would tell you that the public safety would be able to hopefully provide that answer to you.
Okay, you've also talked about the fact that they're having trouble getting police in a lot of communities. Did you look into why that was? Is it that RCMP just can't get enough people to join the RCMP? And if so, why don't people want to join the RCMP? Or is it more specifically that people don't want to go, for example, in remote communities? Not that I know whether you really have a choice if you're a member of the RCMP. I think you go where they tell you to go. But what is the problem in terms of recruitment?
I believe there's a much broader staffing issue at the RCMP, just having enough police officers. A great question to ask, should the RCMP be here, but they did flag for us that remoteness is obviously an issue when it comes to staffing some of these positions.
And at one point you mentioned the fact that there doesn't seem to be enough Indigenous police officers. Do you have specific numbers? Is it any different? Because I know in my neck of the woods, there's Anishinaabe Police Force, which I know has fairly considerable number of Indigenous officers. Did you look at exactly how many they have, how they compare, for example, to the Anishinaabe Police Force, NAPS?
Thanks for the question. So no, we didn't look at the breakdown between the number of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous police officers. What we do know is that there was no national strategy or no national approach that was in place from the RCMP on how to improve the staffing for the FNIPP program, the First Nation Inuit Policing Program. So that's something that we did make a recommendation about, is that we thought that there should be a national approach on how to improve the situation.
Okay. I will now go to Monsieur Lemire, who will have 6 minutes.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you once again for your presentation. Just to go back on something my colleague, Mr. Pawlowski, just mentioned about labor shortage and interest from Indigenous police officers in taking part in these services. So First Nations would like to get greater autonomy in terms of policing services on their territories, and that requires stable and adequately financed policing services, same as the ones provided to other communities in Canada. AFN and other stakeholders have referred to these policing services as essential services. So policing by and for Indigenous communities, and that could also have an impact on recruitment side of things, allowing police officers to be able to come back and be active in their own communities. Is this a path that's been sufficiently explored? Has there been openness from the GRC towards transferring responsibility to the Indigenous policing corps? What's important to underline is that it's not the RCMP that's supposed to transfer the services, it's Public Safety Canada that negotiates the agreements. As we speak, there are about 640 First Nations communities, and there are 36 agreements, which covers 150 to 155 First Nations communities. Funding has been received by Public Safety Canada to go ahead with the transfer, to move communities from the tripartite agreement, where the RCMP provides these services, to autonomous policing frameworks. So the money has really been used to fund the services that have been negotiated as part of these agreements. And that needs to be an objective of Public Safety Canada to carry out these transfers. But as I mentioned, under housing, they have to make sure that the communities have the capacity and are ready to accept the transfer. So if you want to make the transfer a success, I don't know if Melanie would like to add some elements. In our audit, we did not look into the new legislative framework because that was still being developed for essential policing services. We wanted to examine the program as is. The new framework, we can go into that with the departments, but the legislative framework is for the self-managed policing services. But we wanted to focus on the things as they were at the time of the audit. In your presentation, Ms. Oken, and in your report that you published, you mentioned that Public Safety Canada and the RCMP have taken measures that do not align with the objective of strengthening policing services in First Nations communities in line with reconciliation efforts of the Government of Canada. So, should we prioritize self-determination of Indigenous communities, and would that be a step to increase confidence among these communities towards policing services? Would it make a difference for Indigenous communities if it were Indigenous policing services that they have in their communities to have more confidence in the system? It is clear that that would improve confidence in the policing system. But you could also increase this confidence if there is a real negotiation when it's time to sit at the table for these tripartite agreements. The auto-renewal aspect is really an obstacle to having a true and real dialogue. It's not really a negotiation when the federal governments, provincial or territorial governments arrive at the table. So that dynamic could be changed, and of course the transfer to self-administered policing services could be encouraged. Well, the challenge with that is that First Nations do not have access to property tax income, but how would you explain the lack of collaboration between different police services? Is there still systemic racism? Well, there is a history of racism when we talk about the justice system and the policing services, and that is why I would really encourage honest discussions between all stakeholders. As we speak, the RCMP does not sign tripartite agreements. It is important for them to really take into account the new agreements that will be signed so that the adequate level of funding is there and the needs are met in terms of the services that are offered. And that is in line with all of our observations when we talk about all the services provided to these Indigenous communities, drinking water, housing, policing services. It's all about making sure that the communities are at the table.
That's the end of the 6 minutes. We'll go now to Ms. Idlout for her 6 minutes.
I want to inform you that I will be speaking in Inuktitut. Thank you. I have a sore throat. Firstly, I'd like to ask you, you did an audit. Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you. First, I'd like to thank you for your report regarding the police report. The audit that you did on First Nations and Inuit with policing. How many Inuit communities were involved in the audit? How many Inuit communities were involved in the audit?
the witness's voice.
Okay, we'll just check and make sure. Mr. McLeod said
I
he's
think
not
it's
getting
still in translation, or
Ms. Hogan's response on his headset. Okay, okay. We'll carry on then. Okay, so yeah, please continue.
I understand that 680 First Nations and Inuit, but if you look at the regions and the population of Métis, First Nations and Inuit, how many Inuit were actually involved in the audit? And how many Inuit communities participated?
There are a number of communities covered by these two types of agreements. We did a sample, so we did visit and talk to certain communities. I'll have to ask Melanie if she can tell you which communities we actually spoke to. But it isn't about the community service that we were looking at. It's about the service provided by the federal government to these communities. So,
okay, maybe I need to ask my question in English. My question is, since you've indicated in the report 680 First Nations and Inuit communities, what my question is, when you separate First Nations and Inuit, how many of those communities were Inuit communities?
So the number of 680, that's the number that we had from both that came from us publicly. I think there's 51 Inuit communities in Canada based on the publicly available information. As part of the audit, we looked at the communities that were receiving services under this program, and not all, but a lot of communities, Inuit communities, are located in Nunavut, but Nunavut currently only has a framework. So there's no community that receives services under the program. Nunavut has the bilateral framework, so public safety has an agreement with Nunavut to start the program, but there hasn't been any community tripartite agreements signed during the course of our audit. So we couldn't have any communities. We did, though, talk to Inuit organizations, and we did talk to a northern Quebec region where they had Inuit in terms of their population to make sure that that voice was heard.
Okay,
thank you. You may have trouble responding to it, yes. Another question I have regarding First Nations and Inuit who have to move south to urban settings and they have to leave their homeland and they keep moving to urban Canada. I'd like to know, the First Nations Inuit that have moved to urban centers, there are probably an increased number of Inuit and First Nations moving into urban centers. Do you have any idea how many are now living in urban centers like Edmonton, Toronto, and Ottawa? Regarding, I believe a review should be done. Should there be a review of law enforcement in urban centers, given that there are increased number of First Nations and Inuit moving to those urban centers, and they are often arrested for criminal activity? It's important that there be a review of law enforcement when it comes to Indigenous people like Inuit and First Nations living in urban centers, because more and more Indigenous people are moving to urban centers and the numbers are increasing. So therefore, a review of law enforcement should happen in the urban centers regarding the Indigenous people.
Should be done by independent bodies. When it comes to urban centers, however, policing is a provincial matter, right? So what I can look at as the Federal Auditor General is this program where the RCMP provides services, but to actually look at the quality of the services would be something that would need to be looked at provincially or territorially.
Thank you. Lastly, can you, we know that Indigenous Affairs government said 13 million and 45 have been unspent. It's probably more than those monies that have not been spent. I believe, how do you feel that we need to work better with those organizations, because a lot of money is not being spent where it could really improve a lot of situations?
Highlighted that as a finding in our report, that money is going unspent. If I compare it to the first hour of this hearing where we talked about housing, there just isn't enough money there being spent, and here there is money available. When it comes to ensuring the safety and security of a community, it's important to be able to use those funds as they were intended, and even more so under this program, because this program is meant to bring really that community cultural focus and not just be the traditional policing services that one might expect from a police force. So it is about rebuilding that trust, and it is about ensuring that when communities are ready, that they can transfer to self-administered policing services, which ultimately would most likely meet their needs better.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Mr. Shields, who will have the floor for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. The word essential has been used a number of times, but you also talk about program funding. Would you suggest the Ottawa Police is a program-funded essential service?
So I'm aware of the legislation that's trying to have policing services declared essential, but I think it depends. There's different levels of policing services at different levels of the government, and I guess as a citizen, I would appreciate policing services as long as it's done well.
But what I'm suggesting is all the police services that we see in our communities, other than Indigenous, is essential and not program funded. Mm-hmm. But yet, you state in here it's program funded, which means on a yearly basis, somebody's developing a grant application and receiving money for their service. That doesn't happen for the rest of our police forces in Canada.
Well, I think it's important to recognize the two different agreements here, right? The
self-determined ones I've got.
Correct. So if we speak
the
to
tripartite ones I'm talking about, and that's where I'm going.
If we speak to my comments earlier about having a fundamentally different approach when it comes to approaching Indigenous peoples and how services are provided to them, this could be included in that. Is this the right mechanism to have to apply to be part of a tripartite agreement to get access to funding? Right now, that's the current policy environment. So,
but that's not what the rest of the country lives with. What we're under this one on the tripartite agreement, they have to program fund, and that's not how the rest. So when we say essential, as long as it's program funded, it's not essential, because program funding can quickly disappear, where the rest of our police services don't disappear.
Which I believe is the current discussion and debate that's happening around whether or not policing services is an essential service, and how does that impact this program. I would again speak to that siloed approach, right, of how this is really put forward is not working for Indigenous people.
And that's my point. As long as it's program funded, it's not going to work, because the rest of us think it's an essential service, but if it's program funded, it's not an essential service. So you can't use both terms. You can't call it essential if it's program funded.
And this is where policymakers like yourselves can influence in the outcome of the debate on this topic.
But you're using both terms in your report, and that's why I'm trying to clarify this. Because as long as it's program funded, using essential services is an oxymoron in my opinion. So you've got to get it out of the program funding. The self-administered ones is where it's got to move.
Mm-hmm.
So when you mentioned the provinces, because you talked about the provinces, some of them not stepping up. So it was asked if you could supply who isn't stepping up. I know Alberta has. I know they've said, look, we'll do the 48%. If you've got it in your report here that some aren't, could you send us the list of the ones that aren't? Because if you said in your report that some aren't, we'd like to know who they are. So if you're saying that in your report, you must know some aren't.
Well, we definitely know the ones that we've looked at, so we can for sure go back into our files and see what to provide to you. But I do believe that to have a more comprehensive answer, you should absolutely speak with Public Safety Canada. They would be able to give you that answer.
It's your report.
Oh, I can
And you've
provide
alluded to
you
that,
the
you've
support
said
that
it, so you know, if you said that this is an issue, you know who has and who hasn't.
I can absolutely provide you the evidence that I have that supports the statements we've made, but I also believe it's a great question for Public Safety Canada.
I got that. I'm talking to you, though.
Absolutely.
So,
Do you want to jump in?
thank
Go
you.
ahead. Well, if you give us, you still have 2 seconds, I think that Joanne would like to add.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, just to add to that, first for your first part about the co-development legislation. So we do know that public safety is working on that right now. If you have them before the committee, it would be a good time to ask them about the progress that's happening on the co-development work that they're doing. We did see in Budget 2024 that more funding is being allocated to the co-development legislation that's under works. In terms of the provinces, in the report, we did find that money was being lapsed, and we asked public safety why that was the case, because as we note in the report, that was something that we were a bit surprised by, because we know there's been so many observations about the program not having enough funding, and it was public safety that told us that they have to wait for the provinces to come to the table with their funds. So that was public safety's response to us, which we basically wrote in the report, so they would be best suited to explain to you who did come and who didn't, because that was the explanation they gave to us.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, and we're out of time there.
Thanks.
We'll go now to Mr. McLeod, who will have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a real important issue for us in the Northwest Territories. We have 33 communities, and I believe 8 of them don't have any sort of policing. So in the Northwest Territories, the policy is if there is no police, then we can't have a nurse situated in the communities because of safety issues. It also means that we have people that are caught in very abusive relationships, abusive situations, and they have nowhere to turn. And in many cases, the only way is to get out of the community, to go to the regional center. So we have a real challenge with some of our small communities and out-migration to the regional centers, where in a lot of cases, people are ending up on the street or couch surfing. I've heard from a lot of the leaders in these small communities that tell me that their lives are being threatened because if their situation develops in a community, there's no police, they go to the chief or one of the counselors. And a number of these leaders, a couple of the chiefs for sure, have almost lost their lives. I've had chiefs tell me about being on their knees with a 12-gauge shotgun pointed at their chest because the guy was going crazy and there's nobody to stop him, and he had to try to intervene. So it's really concerning. The drug issue, alcohol and drugs, is growing in the north. We're starting to see the issues that we used to watch on TV happening in the south and on the reserves in the south, now in our communities. And gangs, the drug dealers are really influencing what's happening in our communities. And that's a real concern. And in the situation of the North, in the Northwest Territories specifically, the ability to fund police service is a challenge. You know, we've been really struggling to keep cash flow to the territorial government because of the floods, because of the fires, evacuations, and affording the cost share portion for the RCMP has been a real challenge. But it's also a real challenge when it comes to Indigenous policing. You know, as an MP, I've supported more allocation for Indigenous policing, a bigger budget, but it doesn't make any difference because the partners that we're hoping will join us, the territorial governments, can't afford to pay for the policing. It doesn't matter if it's RCMP or the Indigenous policing. So we always hit the wall where my questioning or anybody else that's questioning it will hear that the territorial governments don't have enabling legislation. And when you talk to the territorial government, you can see that there's really no incentive for them to do the work that it takes to get the legislation drafting because you can't afford to join the program anyway. So I wanted to know that during your audit, did your office identify reasons as to why no communities in the Northwest Territories or Nunavut have signed tripartite agreements in place to receive enhanced police services under the program?
So that would be an excellent question to ask the department. When we saw that there were bilateral agreements for Nunavut, there was an idea that there now is a bilateral agreement which wasn't there before, which are a precursor to have those CTAs. If you don't have those agreements, you can't go to a CTA. In Northwest Territory, there were more funds allocated under the framework agreement. One of the reasons we were told is around staffing, having officers to be able to do those CTAs. But again, that would be something to ask the department. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, we're out of time. You're done yet. So we're going to go now to Mr. Lemire, who will have 2.5 minutes. And just looking at the time, I thought we might be able to get another short one in for the Conservatives and the Liberals, but it does look like after the Bloc and the NDP get their questions, we will be at the end of our session. So Mr. Lemire, we'll go with you for your 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Pour pouvoir déposer la motion suivante qu'on a envoyée préalablement au greffier, qui est en lien avec un événement fâchant qui est arrivé cette semaine, c'est-à-dire que le personnel de...
That has to do with an unfortunate event that happened this week. Ms. Wutausnipiaks had an incident, so the motion is the following. Sacred Indigenous items deserve respect. They have cultural, spiritual, and honorary meaning. The objective of this motion is to take into account what has happened. And the great national chief, Ms. Wutausnipiak, got an apology from the airline company, but nonetheless, some questions need to be asked because the item in question holds honorary value for ceremonies and First Nations. The item is used for leadership ceremonies, so it has sacred meaning and value. And what happened is particularly controversial. And I would like to remind CATSA rules, which say that Indigenous practices and cultural practices and beliefs and faiths of passengers need to be respected. And when we talk about sacred Indigenous items, we could also talk about the displacement of artifacts of the Huron-Wendat Nation, and once again we owe our respects to that. So that is the motion. I don't know if the committee is ready to adopt it, if it could be done now, or we can do it on Wednesday as well. Thank you.
Yeah, because we haven't had the notice, this would be putting it on notice, and so now it'll have to be available for 24 hours, and then it can be debated. So on Wednesday, we will have committee business. We could carry it on then.
C'est parfait. Merci.
Okay, and you have 10 seconds left if you otherwise we'll move to Ms. Edlout, who will have her 2.5 minutes with the Auditor General and her team.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. When I go to the communities that I represent, all have said to me that they may have the RCMP in the community, they may settle in the community, and they are welcome by the community, and they work well together. But this problem persists. The police in the daytime work in the daytime only. In the evenings, they take a break because they need to rest. But when there's women to be protected or elders and children to be protected in the evening because there's violence in the family, whether it's alcohol or drug induced, they call the RCMP detachment. They get a reply from Central Office Iqaluit, not from the local detachment. And they only speak in English from that detachment in Iqaluit. So there's a communication problem. How can we improve communication between the RCMP police and the community members? I know that they need to rest in the evening, and Central Iqaluit RCMP answers the call, and they only speak English. How can we improve the communication here?
I think as we previously answered, there are no community tripartite agreements in Nunavut, but the way I would approach this, I think, is a link to a finding that we saw here around the services provided by the RCMP, is that I think it starts with being in the community and understanding the community, but then also to be familiar with culture and tradition, you need to have training beyond the normal sensitivity training that police officers might have. And what we found is that that was not happening in a consistent way. And I think that that would be a great place to start, is to ensure that police officers are aware of the uniqueness of communities, your cultures, and then
I'm so sorry
be
to
embedded.
interrupt you. I don't know if my question was
Sorry.
translated into English properly, because I was talking about the importance of respecting charter rights. And if Nunavummiut are not getting their charter rights to secure life security of the person, when their call is being answered in Iqaluit and they're not able to get the protection that they need in their communities. It's not about communication, but about service and whether their rights are being respected in terms of getting the protection that they need in the community. Maybe the response can be in written form so that we can close in time.
So thank you for providing the clarification. It did not translate, the question did not translate that way at all. I think I can answer it rather quickly in that we didn't look at the charter rights and the impact linked within Nunavut community, so I wouldn't have anything further to offer.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to the end of our time. So to the Auditor General and Madame or Ms. Hogan, thank you for your excellent work and for being here, as well as to Ms. Schwartz and Ms. Joannes. Thank you for your time, and colleagues, we will continue to try to get a date as soon as possible with the various ministers, their teams, to continue this discussion. But for
Point of
today,
order.
okay, Ms. Idlout.
If I may, can I send an email question to them that they can answer, given that it wasn't interpreted properly?
We can send it to them, absolutely. So if you could direct that to the clerk, we can share it with the Auditor General's office. There may or may not be information that can be provided, as was stated. So, but please, yes, direct it, and we'll see what we can get. But for right now, colleagues, we are adjourned.
Merci.